Hey buddy. Today we're going to talk about one of the most debated mysteries of ancient history. The Barabar Caves, a series of 7 man-made caverns in northeastern India that were believed to have been created between 322 and 185 BCE for King Ashoka during the time of the Mauryan Empire. These are the oldest man-made caves in India, and they're absolutely incredible. There are 2 separate collections of caves carved into solid granite rock formations. 4 of the caves are in Barabar Hill, carved into a rock formation geologists call a whale's back, and 3 of the caves are carved into Nagarjuni Hill in a separate granite formation. And considering they're almost 2,500 years old, they're in immaculate condition. These caves might be moderate in size, but they're incredibly precise for their time, and they're basically unmatched by anything like them in the ancient world. Using sound and laser measuring devices, in some of these chambers we find perfectly vertical walls in some places, perfectly straight lines in some places, and fairly impressive symmetry all around. The most amazing features are the polished walls, ceilings, and floors. Some of them have a very reflective, nearly glass-like finish to them. They're basically like mirrors. I understand why so many people consider these caves to be mysterious. There's nothing that we can compare them to that's exactly like them on Earth. There are a lot of questions about these caves, and the alternative history community argues that it would have been impossible for the people of their time to create them. There are some confusing inconsistencies around these caves, and it's not exactly explicitly clear who built them or why. However, we're not dealing with the same level of mystery that we get from places like ancient Egypt. We're not dealing with the same level of impossibility we are from ancient Bronze Age structures. The reason that we're skeptical that the ancient Egyptians carved granite so efficiently, for example, is because the Egyptians should have only had access to copper tools and diorite implements, which should have made precision extremely difficult. So perfectly symmetrical statues and perfectly polished granite blocks are a bit of an enigma, but this isn't the case with the Barabar Caves. The Barabar Caves were built after the Iron Age, closer to the early Classical era. Based on what we know about granite stonework today and the technology that was available to the Mauryan Empire at the time, I think that it would have been more than possible for the people of the 1st and 2nd century to be able to carve these caves out. In fact, there are even more impressive structures in India that are much larger and even more complex than these caves. So why is there so much skepticism about the official story behind these caves? Alternative history enthusiasts will try to tell you that these caves are perfect and that they had to have been built using lost ancient high technology. However, there are quite a few flaws in these structures. The walls are mostly flat and level in most of these caves. However, they're not as perfect as alternative history enthusiasts will try to argue. There's curves and warping on many of the surfaces, as well as the occasional bulge and divot. The sound and laser scans reveal imprecision in the overall consistency. Nothing is exactly perfectly straight or symmetrical. Some of the features are nearly perfect, but the overall construction is not actually that perfect and precise. There was a documentary called BAM, where a group of researchers visited Barabar Caves, measuring the walls for their flatness, and they tried to argue that the walls are flat within a few microns. But the device that they used to demonstrate this actually only measures the smoothness of a surface, not the flatness. In fact, we can actually tell that the walls are not perfectly flat simply by looking at the reflections on the surface. Yes, this is a mirror image we can see on the right, but if this wall were perfectly flat, the mirror image would perfectly match the man on the left. But it does not. The mirror image is warped, and the reflection appears mildly shorter than the man. This is very impressive, I agree, but we have to be honest here. A perfectly flat surface should reflect a perfectly identical image. But what's funny though is that these smoothness tests also completely betrayed their theory that these walls had to have been carved with ancient high technology. The smoothness of the walls varied wildly even within each individual cave. Some areas are extremely smooth, down to 0.00033 millimeters, but other areas were closer to 0.005 millimeters. Yes, that's still extremely smooth. The overall quality of the caves is still impressive, but this proves that the walls were polished by hand and not using secret lost technology. I mean, advanced technology should be able to create a much more consistent polish across the entire cave. As far as we can tell, several of the Barabar caves were created for various religious practices. At least one of them was built for a religious group called the Ajivika, and one of them was built for Buddhists, with each room serving as some kind of a resonance chamber for meditation and ceremonies. The caves were likely used as homes and shelters for monks that practiced simple, isolated lives of abstinence from any kind of comfort or pleasure. One cave has a relief that likely held a statue, and the majority of the caves have a small altar for offerings and worship. Strangely though, the engraving inside of the Karan Chopar cave says that it was donated to the locals by King Ashoka to provide shelter from the rain during the monsoon season. This cave was just a storm shelter. This is one of the simpler caves in the collection, for sure, but it also includes a worship altar. The engraving for this cave also includes a hint about Buddhism, but we don't know if that's because it was donated to Buddhists, or if it was just because King Ashoka was a Buddhist himself. Which he was. Alternative history enthusiasts are very skeptical about this cave in particular. They argue that it's overbuilt for a simple rain shelter, but you could also argue that that's the point. By building these caves deep into solid stone, they're essentially permanent structures that can't be easily destroyed. They're immune to bad weather and earthquakes, and they can't be destroyed by raiders. And they're also high up on a hill, safe from floods, which is perfect for monsoon shelters. The size of each of the Barabar caves is fairly modest. They range between the size of a bedroom to the size of an apartment. These caverns aren't as ornately decorated as the temples and palaces from ancient India. Some of the caves don't have any art around them at all, and the caves are somewhat isolated. They're not easily accessible. These caves weren't really designed for mass public use. They would have only really served a small group of locals. I believe that the official story for these caves is true, but I also think that they leave us with a lot of questions. If the caves were merely shelters or isolated places of worship, why were they built with this level of precision? Why was it so important for King Ashoka to make these obscure caves this close to perfect? Especially when you consider that at least one of them was donated to members of a completely different religious sect from his own religion. Why were they polished down to display a reflective glass-like shine better than the vast majority of granite structures of their time? Why go through all of this effort to carve out these chambers into solid granite at all, when it would have just been easier to stack stones into conventional buildings? And why was the cave that was donated as a rain shelter built to the same quality as the caves that were designed for worship? Why would its walls need to be polished when a rough-cut chamber would serve the exact same purpose? I mean, it would have taken the masons as much effort to create these caves as it would have been for them to create a full-sized temple or cathedral. With the time and effort that they took to make these caves, they could have made dozens of larger structures instead. What significance could these caves have held that it was worth building them with such precision in such an isolated area? One of the arguments that alternative history enthusiasts will use is that the engravings on the caves don't tell you how the caves were built, and they don't even explicitly explain when they were built or why. The inscriptions for many of the caves merely explain that King Ashoka donated these caves, who he donated them to, and when he donated them. But just because they were donated at these times doesn't mean that that's when they were built. These inscriptions could have very easily have been added long after the caves were originally constructed. And really, I'll admit that the inscriptions look much more crude than the rest of the structures. They aren't polished the same way as everything else. It looks as if the inscriptions were carved through the polished surface of the wall to reveal the raw, rough stone underneath. The artistic carvings around the caves, like the statues outside or the entrance doorways, have a very specific recessed look, where the entire space around them was carved out to frame the design. But the inscriptions explaining how and why the king donated these caves are just carved directly into the surface of the cave wall, with no recess and no framing. The lettering is very shallow in comparison and actually ruins the otherwise perfect precision of the design of the cave walls. Besides the graffiti, these engravings are easily the biggest blemish on the otherwise perfect cave walls. So even though these caves were donated to various parties for various reasons, it is possible that the king merely inherited these caves from an earlier dynasty. But these mysteries are not proof that the Mauryan Empire could not build these caves themselves, as much as the alternative history community would want you to believe. Even though some of the caves only have engravings explaining when they were donated, other caves, such as the Dasharatha caves, explicitly explain who it was that built them and when. They were built by the Dasharatha people of the 1st and 2nd century BCE, which places them in the exact same time period as the Mauryan Empire, which is really good proof that the Mauryan people also built the other caves. The most interesting caves are a set of twin caverns that were built right next to each other. On the side of the Whale's Back Formation is the entrance to the Sudama cave, which might be the most impressive of all the caves in the region. The engravings say that it was donated in 261 BC. When you enter, the hallway leads to the main chamber, which is carved like a half cylinder. On the right side of the main room, you can see a small inlet on the wall that would have likely have held a statue. Then on the left side, there's an entrance to a second chamber within this cave, which is designed like a round dome. Interestingly, the exterior of the second chamber is also rounded and has a curved overhang almost like a mushroom cap, with a lip that hangs down from the ceiling. This part of the cave is completely over-designed. There's no reason to add this level of detail. In my opinion, it was probably designed like this to reflect sound out and away from the domed room, allowing it to be that much more isolated. I think the purpose of the second chamber was likely to create a specific harmonic resonance frequency that you could achieve with singing or chanting. The domed room was likely an ideal place to meditate. When we go back outside and move to the right of the entrance of the Sudama cave, we'll find the next cavern called the Lomas Rishi cave, which is believed to have been created a little bit later. The exterior of the Lomas Rishi cave is the most impressive of all of the caves. The entrance is inlaid with an intricate, ornate design similar to Buddhist art, which leads to a narrow doorway. The Lomas Rishi cave is clearly designed to be identical to the Sudama cave, with a large cylindrical room on one side and a doorway which leads to a second chamber that's shaped like a dome. However, for some reason, it was abandoned before it was completed. There's no inscription on the Lomas Rishi cave at all, so it's impossible to know for sure exactly who built it, when they built it, or why. It was probably built for the same purpose as the Sudama cave, but there's no way of knowing for sure. Maybe it was commissioned by King Ashoka, but then it was abandoned when he passed away, or maybe it was constructed by his son or his grandson. There are several theories. The only inscription that we can find on the Lomas Rishi cave is on the exterior, and it actually comes from a later king who was merely bragging about his connection to the earlier Mauryan dynasty. But that later king doesn't claim to be the one who built the cave. He was just attaching his name to the cave in order to brag. The Lomas Rishi cave completely destroys the ancient lost technology theory or the previous civilization theory, because this cave was left rough and unfinished. And because it's unfinished, it gives us some really good clues as to how the stonework was done during the construction of the other caves. Alternative historians argue that there's no clear explanation as to how the masons of their time were actually able to carve these structures out. But in this unfinished cave, they left tool marks behind, and there's no indication of machine power tools or or high technology of any kind. These marks and grooves on the floors and ceilings were made with chisels and pickaxes, manual labor with hand tools. The ceiling of the main room is low and uneven, and only a couple of the walls were polished. And the second chamber is even more unfinished than the first chamber. The floor is too high, the walls are completely uneven, and the ceiling is very low. And again, there appears to be chisel marks everywhere. Maybe they were leaving the best for last, trying to create their masterpiece, but then they had to abandon it at the end. Alternative historians have argued that they believe that this cave was built thousands of years after the other caves, and the reason that it's so rough and unfinished on the inside is because the masons who built it were not as skilled or as advanced as the lost civilization that built the other caves. This is silly. There's no reason to believe that this cave wasn't built in the same time period as the other caves by masons who were equally as skilled. The best evidence that they have to suggest that this cave was built by an inferior group of masons at a later date is that the entrance to the doorway isn't perfectly centered with the artwork or the relief. But the problem with that argument is that none of the entrance doorways are centered with their relief. The relief is crooked or slanted on every single doorway. This is simply a feature of these caves. You know that I'm a fan of alternative history theories. I've discussed quite a few over the years. But alternative history enthusiasts like to believe that all of the mysterious granite structures that we find all over the ancient world must have been built using lasers or ancient high technology by a lost civilization, and that this lost civilization must have existed thousands of years before any of these ancient structures were believed to have been built. And alternative historians believe this because so many of these structures are so impressive and precise. And though I believe that ancient machinery might have been used on some of these structures around the world, and that some of them are older than we think, the Barabar caves do not fit that paradigm at all. These chisel marks in the Lomas Rishi cave indicate that these caves were, in fact, carved out by hand. Clearly, the masons who built these caves were extremely skilled and dedicated to their craft. Ancient India is one of the epicenters of ancient civilization, and it's really insensitive to the people of India to suggest that their ancestors were not capable of achieving this kind of artistry or precision. Their masons were among some of the best the world has ever seen, and there are plenty of structures around India that demonstrate that. I just wanted to thank my patrons and my channel members for supporting my videos. I could not do this without you. All of my supporters get to watch my videos in advance, and you get access to exclusive content. Patrons and Ko-fi members also get access to the Armored Skeptic Discord server. Thank you so much. I love you guys. You're amazing. It's possible that King Ashoka merely inherited these caves from a previous dynasty, and then he donated them to various groups as homes, shelters, and temples. Maybe there's more to these caves than King Ashoka's engravings tell us. Hell, maybe there's more to these caves than King Ashoka even knew. Just because these caves were hand-carved doesn't necessarily have to mean that they were made in the 2nd century BCE. However, we cannot say that these caves are perfectly precise, and we can't say that the Mauryan people of the 2nd century BCE were incapable of carving them. The caves are not laser and machine precise. The Mauryan people of the 2nd century BC absolutely 100% could have made these caves. There's more than enough evidence to suggest that they did. With all of that said, I believe that the Barabar caves are some of the most impressive structures ever created. Truly a masterful achievement of the ancient world.